It began on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the air smelled like cut grass and peace. The birds were chirping, the sun was mild, and everything felt steady, until I saw the envelope. A bright white letter tucked under my door with bold, red lettering that read, "Notice of Violation." At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone else's notice had been slipped under my door by accident. But as I opened it, my heart sank. It was from the Homeowners Association, the same HOA that had been a thorn in everyone's side for months. The letter claimed that my tractor, a small, old green John Deere that I used to maintain my property, was in clear violation of neighborhood aesthetics. According to the HOA, farm equipment wasn't allowed to be parked on residential driveways. That would have been understandable, maybe, if this were a massive industrial tractor sitting in the front yard. But it wasn't. It was a compact, well-kept machine I'd used for years to mow grass, clear snow, and help neighbors when they needed it. It wasn't rusted, it wasn't noisy, it was just practical. But practicality didn't matter to the HOA. They fined me $250 for the offense. At first, I laughed. Then, I looked closer. The letter wasn't just a warning, it was a demand. It said if I didn't pay within 15 days and remove the equipment, the fines would increase weekly, and legal action could follow. Something about the tone, the arrogance, the assumption that they had power over everything, stirred something inside me. It wasn't just about the tractor anymore. It was about the principle. The HOA had gone too far, and I wasn't the only one who felt that way. For months, neighbors had whispered about the HOA's overreach. There were fines for mailboxes being the wrong color, for flower beds that didn't match approved landscaping, even for Halloween decorations being too scary. It wasn't a community anymore, it was a dictatorship run by a few people who loved control more than cooperation. And at the center of it all was Janet, the HOA president, the self-appointed enforcer of order. Janet had turned her role into a full-time power trip. She'd patrol the neighborhood in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, snapping pictures of any violations. People joked that she had the neighborhood memorized better than her own house. That I started noticing more of her patrols after that letter. She'd slow down in front of my driveway, squinting through her oversized sunglasses, pretending not to stare. Sometimes she'd even take photos of my property while pretending to check her phone. It was obvious she wanted me to move the tractor just to prove she could make me bend the rules, but I didn't move it. Days turned into a week, and the second notice arrived. This time, the fine had doubled. They accused me of non-compliance and intentional disregard of community standards. The words made it sound like I was vandalizing the neighborhood, all because of a piece of machinery parked neatly by my garage. That's when I decided to fight back. That I spent that evening reading the HOA bylaws, line by line, word by word. If they were going to use their own rules against me, I'd learn those rules better than they ever did. It took hours, but eventually, I found something interesting. The bylaws mentioned commercial equipment being prohibited, but they didn't define what counted as commercial. The rule was vague, intentionally vague, it seemed, to allow the board to interpret it however they pleased. My tractor wasn't commercial equipment. I didn't use it for business. I used it for property maintenance, which, according to another section of the bylaws, was encouraged for homeowners. They'd trapped themselves in their own wording. So, I wrote a formal appeal, calm, respectful, but firm. I included photos, maintenance logs, and a detailed explanation of how my tractor didn't violate any rule. I hand-delivered it to the HOA office the next morning and even got a time-stamped copy for proof. Days passed without a word. Then, an email arrived from Janet herself. It was short and smug. The board has reviewed your appeal and decided that the fine stands. Please remove the equipment immediately. That was it. No reasoning. No discussion. Just arrogance wrapped in authority that I realized then that logic wasn't going to win. They weren't enforcing fairness, they were enforcing control. And control only breaks when it's challenged publicly. So I started planning something bigger. That weekend, while most neighbors were indoors avoiding Janet's constant rule watching, I rolled my tractor down the driveway and began cleaning it. The engine roared to life, loud and proud, echoing down the street. Heads turned. Curtains moved. People peeked out, curious that I wasn't hiding anymore. That I washed it, waxed it, and parked it right at the edge of my driveway, perfectly legal, completely visible. Then, I put up a sign beside it that read, "This tractor mows lawns, clears snow, and helps neighbors." Apparently that's a crime. By evening, the entire neighborhood was talking. Some came by to laugh, others to show quiet support. A few even whispered that they'd been fined for silly reasons too. Suddenly, my tractor wasn't just a violation, it was a symbol. Janet must have seen it because the next morning, another letter appeared on my door, this one more aggressive than ever. Failure to comply will result in property lien consideration. But by then, I wasn't scared. I was motivated. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. And not behind closed doors, but right where everyone could see it. So I came up with a plan that would make sure no one in that HOA ever forgot the sound of my tractor again. The next morning, the street buzzed with an unusual energy. What had started as a personal fight over a small green tractor was beginning to take on a life of its own. Word had spread faster than I expected. Neighbors whispered across fences, shared messages in private groups, and even the local kids seemed to know the story. The quiet cul-de-sac, normally a picture of suburban calm, was now brimming with anticipation. Everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for the next move in this escalating battle between a single homeowner and the relentless HOA. I spent hours that day preparing my tractor for action. It wasn't just about cleaning or waxing it anymore, it was about making a statement. I polished every inch, attached a few makeshift flags, and even rigged a small speaker to play upbeat, rebellious music. It was going to be more than a machine, it was going to be a spectacle. The idea wasn't just defiance, it was performance. I wanted the HOA to see that control wasn't something they could wield unquestioned, and I wanted the neighborhood to feel a sense of empowerment alongside me. By late afternoon, I started inviting others to join. At first, it was casual. "Hey, bring your mower, got a golf cart?" Perfect. Within hours, the invitation spread. People I barely knew offered to bring tractors, ATVs, even old lawnmowers. It was turning into a neighborhood convoy. The energy was palpable, the anticipation building. It was no longer just about my tractor. It was about everyone who had felt silenced, fined, or unfairly targeted by the HOA. I lined up my tractor at the start of the street, engines idling. One by one, neighbors joined, their machines rumbling to life in sync. The parade began slowly, a low hum that reverberated across the neighborhood. Then it picked up speed. Horns blared, engines roared, and the music from my speaker filled the air. Windows rattled. Dogs barked. People poured out of their homes, phones in hand, capturing the spectacle. It was chaotic and beautiful, and there she was. Janet, the HOA president, standing on her porch, arms crossed, face tight with disbelief. She hadn't expected this. No one had. She muttered to herself, waving her clipboard like it could stop the growing crowd of machines rolling past her house. But nothing could stop it. The parade wasn't just a protest, it was a message. It was visible, loud, and undeniable. Neighbors began joining spontaneously, cheering from lawns, waving flags, even clapping along to the music. Some carried signs with cheeky slogans like, "Mow the law, not our rights," or "Tractors before tyrants." What had begun as a personal grievance had transformed into a public display of resistance, a collective statement that the HOA's petty rules would no longer go unchallenged. Janet tried to maintain composure, but it was slipping. She barked orders through her megaphone, demanding everyone disperse, claiming they were violating noise ordinances and blocking streets. But the crowd was undeterred. Every attempt to quiet the parade was met with louder engines, more cheers, and even an impromptu chorus of whistles from spectators. Her authority, once absolute, had cracked in plain view. I led the parade down the main street, weaving in perfect formation with a mix of tractors, lawnmowers, and ATVs. The spectacle drew attention beyond our small neighborhood. Drivers slowed, curious onlookers snapped photos, and a few even joined from adjacent streets, turning the event into something larger than I had ever imagined. Social media notifications exploded as videos and images began circulating. The story of a single tractor versus an overbearing HOA president was captivating people in ways no one could have predicted. By the time we returned to the cul-de-sac, the message was clear. Janet was no longer the unchallenged ruler of the neighborhood. Her letters, fines, and warnings had failed to intimidate. What had started as a one-person protest had evolved into a community uprising, and the power dynamics had shifted. People laughed, cheered, and shared stories of their own minor grievances. The parade wasn't just about my tractor anymore, it was about reclaiming a sense of community that had been eroded by fear and control. The HOA board met later that evening in an emergency session. I didn't attend, but I heard through the grapevine that their discussion was frantic. They argued about the legality of fines, whether to escalate enforcement, and how to regain control of the neighborhood. But the public nature of the parade had complicated their plans. Any drastic action risked backlash, media coverage, and further humiliation. They were trapped in a corner of their own making, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Meanwhile, in my driveway, my tractor stood gleaming, almost triumphant. It had become a symbol of defiance, a visible reminder that the neighborhood could no longer be ruled by arbitrary rules and fear. People came by throughout the evening, offering congratulations, sharing stories, and even asking how they could protect themselves from similar harassment. The sense of empowerment was contagious, and yet, I knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA had resources, influence, and persistence. They could escalate further, perhaps through legal channels or fines that couldn't be ignored. But for now, the parade had shifted the balance. The message was clear: no more quiet compliance. No more silent suffering under petty rules. The streets, for one unforgettable day, belonged to the residents, and their voices had been heard. As night fell, I parked the tractor in its usual spot, engines off, but the victory still humming in the air. Streetlights cast long shadows, the hum of engines replaced by murmurs of conversation, and somewhere, Janet sat behind her blinds, calculating her next move. I knew she wouldn't give up easily. But neither would I. The first chapter of the fight had ended, but the real confrontation was just beginning. The streets had been claimed, the community energized, and the HOA had been humiliated. The next phase would require strategy, courage, and a little audacity. The days following the tractor parade were surreal. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement, gossip, and a newfound sense of solidarity. People whispered about the audacity of one man standing up to the HOA, and the story had spread far beyond our cul-de-sac. Social media posts and viral videos circulated, showing the convoy of tractors, lawnmowers, and ATVs rolling triumphantly through the streets. Every like, share, and comment felt like another small victory in what had become a larger-than-life battle, but behind the scenes, the HOA was furious. Janet and her board were working overtime to regain control. Letters, emails, and notices flooded my mailbox. Fines had skyrocketed, threats of legal action loomed, and the tone was more hostile than ever. They claimed I was violating multiple sections of the bylaws, that the parade had disrupted the neighborhood, and that the property lien process would begin immediately. It was intimidation, nothing more, nothing less, that I didn't panic. I had spent weeks preparing for this. I knew that logic and legality were my allies. The bylaws were poorly written, the rules intentionally vague, and the HOA had overstepped in almost every way possible. My tractor, the parade, and my actions had exposed the absurdity of their authority. I reviewed every letter, every rule, and every clause with painstaking detail. Every time they tried to escalate, I was ready with evidence, photos, and documentation, but I also knew that this was no longer just about rules. This was about power, and power had a way of corrupting even the most reasonable people. Janet wanted control back, and she was willing to push as far as she could. I had to plan carefully. The first step was public accountability. I reached out to neighbors who had watched the parade and those who had suffered under the HOA's petty fines. I created a small coalition, not an aggressive mob, but a network of informed, empowered residents who were ready to support each other. Together, we documented every violation, every arbitrary fine, and every abusive interaction. Each piece of evidence strengthened our position. Meanwhile, I made sure my tractor remained visible. Every morning, it sat polished and ready in my driveway, a silent challenge to the HOA's attempts at intimidation. Sometimes, I even moved it slightly into the street, a subtle reminder that the community was watching. People would stop, wave, and nod in approval. It had become a symbol, not of rebellion for its own sake, but of standing up to unnecessary authority. Janet didn't respond well. She tried to escalate, sending her most aggressive letters yet. She even attempted to hold an emergency HOA meeting to discuss emergency measures against me. But every attempt backfired. Our coalition attended the meeting en masse, armed with evidence, prepared to confront her claims. Cameras rolled, witnesses spoke, and her words of authority lost all weight in the face of truth and transparency. The meeting, intended to intimidate, became a turning point. By now, the neighborhood was fully awake. People who had been silent for years found their voices. Minor violations, ridiculous fines, and petty harassment were suddenly being challenged everywhere. It wasn't just about my tractor anymore, it was about reclaiming the community from fear. Janet's control slipped further each day. Her letters, once feared, were now mocked. Her threats became a topic of laughter at block gatherings. Even the local news caught wind of the story, a small suburban revolt against an overreaching HOA president, and suddenly, we were no longer just a neighborhood, we were a symbol. In the end, the showdown didn't require lawsuits or violence. It required visibility, persistence, and a refusal to back down. The HOA, pressured by public scrutiny, social media, and united neighbors, eventually relented. The fines were reduced, then rescinded. The bylaws were clarified, and a new process for fair and transparent rule enforcement was implemented. Janet remained president, but her authority was tempered by accountability. The community had reminded her, and everyone, that power without respect was meaningless. My tractor, now more than just a machine, became part of local legend. Children would ride along with me in the yard, neighbors would ask for rides during block parties, and stories of the tractor parade circulated for years. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was no trophy, no ceremony, no grand headline in the paper. But the neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson: unity, courage, and principle could outshine intimidation and fear. As for me, I continued to care for my property, my tractor humming faithfully in the driveway, a symbol of persistence and resilience. Occasionally, I'd look at the spot where Janet once stood on her porch, arms crossed, and smile. We had turned the streets into a stage, and on that stage, the truth had spoken louder than any rule or fine. The HOA had learned, and so had the neighborhood. The story of the tractor, humble, green, and steadfast, had reminded everyone that fairness, justice, and a sense of community were more powerful than any set of arbitrary rules. And while the battle had ended, the legend of that tractor parade lived on, inspiring anyone who had ever felt powerless to stand tall and make their voice heard.